If you had to put a grade on the Minnesota Vikings offseason, their moves, the decision to sign Sam Darnold and draft J.J. McCarthy, the decision to trade up to number 23 and then take that pick and trade up to number 17 and get Dallas Turner, what would your grade be? Comment below and hit that subscribe button right there. And this Minnesota Vikings podcast presented by Minnesota Tim, that's me, will show up in your feed every day. While you're here, let me tell you about Hochland Farm. Hochland Farm has rotationally grazed 100% grass-fed beef. This beef is sold in quarters and halves, and they have custom sample packs so you can try before you buy. Contact Hochland Farm at 952-491-1541 and get 20% off your first order by mentioning the Minnesota Tim podcast.
No regard for human life.
20% off 952-491-1541. That's Hochland Farm. Get great beef in your freezers today. Okay, so the reason why I asked you what you would grade the Minnesota Vikings offseason as is because ESPN did their grade on the Minnesota Vikings offseason. And they weren't massive haters of the Vikings offseason, but they weren't lovers of the offseason either. And Seth Walder, if that's how you pronounce his name, went after the Vikings pretty good, giving it a C-. And he ranked it the third worst of the 32 teams. And this is what he had to say. By the way, I'm getting this from MinnesotaSportsFan.com. Great Minnesota sports website. So head there for great Minnesota sports knowledge. Seth writes this. He says, at first blush, the team's move to surrender a future second-round pick to move up from 42 to 23 seemed odd. That's the trade with the Houston Texans. What Minnesota gave up was worth more than what it got back, but the assumption was that it was part of a larger package with the number 11 pick to trade up into the early part of the first round for a quarterback. When it became apparent that wasn't the case, the move looked illogical. And they says, combining the decision to acquire a second-round pick while also moving up to 17 in order to draft Dallas Turner, Walder wasn't a fan of the value lost at all. And then he says, later in the first round, the team traded a ton of value to move up from 23 to 17 for Turner. It was a very pricey trade in its own right, but if we consider the entire move from 42 to 17 and combine the two trades, it was an overwhelming price to pay. Now, I could not disagree with Seth any more than I could possibly say. Because I disagree with him wholeheartedly. Because if you look at the trades the Minnesota Vikings made, J.J. McCarthy was projected potentially to go in the top 5 of the NFL draft. Think about it like this. The Minnesota Vikings, like I thought, like a lot of people thought, we're going to have to trade number 11, number 23, and a second or third round pick the following year to get to number 5 and select J.J. McCarthy. Instead, what happened was the Vikings traded one spot to number 10, kept pick 23, used that pick to get to number 17, and selected one of the top defensive players in the entire NFL draft. A defensive player wasn't selected until like pick 14, 15, something like that. And the Minnesota Vikings got a top defensive player in the NFL draft because they didn't mortgage their future to draft a guy they thought they could get at number 10, and they were right. Now, I'm not a Minnesota Vikings just like this, bleed purple and gold all the time. Every decision they make is right and true, and it's the best thing for the franchise, yada, 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 yada. But I am going to disagree 100% with Seth because this Minnesota Vikings offseason could have easily been a D-, an F, because it seemed like in all likelihood for the Minnesota Vikings to get the quarterback that they wanted, they were going to have to trade up 6 spots with the Los Angeles Chargers to get their guy. And they didn't have to do that. They made a bet that the New York Giants were not going to draft J.J. McCarthy, that the Denver Broncos or the Las Vegas Raiders weren't going to jump the Minnesota Vikings and get J.J. McCarthy in the top 10 of the NFL draft. And they got their guy by trading only 1 spot ahead to get that pick. Now, if this report said something along the lines of, they signed Sam Darnold, who bounced around the league from the Jets to the Panthers to the 49ers, now to the Vikings. It's his 4th team in 7 years. Okay, I get that perspective. But he attacks the Minnesota Vikings draft and calls it a C- when, in my opinion, the Minnesota Vikings draft was an A+. Because, sure, did they give up a couple of mid-round picks that you could add value to your team for guys that could be potential superstars like Dallas Turner in the NFL draft? Sure, I guess they did that. But if Dallas Turner ends up being one of the top defensive ends in all of the NFL, then giving up a random mid-round pick in the NFL draft was worth it. So, I don't know. This report giving the Minnesota Vikings a C-, I think is preposterous. Preposterous.
Huh?
Preposterous. Preposterous. Am I saying that right? I feel like I'm saying that wrong. Preposterous. It's blasphemy. I know I'm saying that word right. Anyways, the Minnesota Vikings offseason as a whole, I would give it a B+ because they signed JJ. They got that deal done. They brought in Sam Darnold, who I think will shock the world this year. They got their quarterback of the future, and they also replaced Danielle Hunter with Jonathan Greenard, Dallas Turner, Van Winkle, and they also got a good, solid linebacker from the Houston Texans, too, who played for the Minnesota Golden Gophers. So I don't understand at all where these ESPN reports are coming from, because I think they lack an understanding of the potential superstars the Minnesota Vikings got in the NFL draft. And they also built their team. They didn't re-sign Danielle Hunter to all this money, and they were able to build a team with more depth, more cornerbacks like Shaq Griffin, who Seth Walder also criticized because the Minnesota Vikings had to give up a compensatory pick in the future. It's like, big deal. The Vikings needed cornerback help badly. Have you looked at their roster? My heavens, it is the absolute worst cornerback roster in the league, and they needed some positions at that spot. They needed some players to fill that role, and they brought in a veteran who's been around the league, who's got experience, and they got him in. They needed that badly. It's the biggest hole on the roster. So, anyways, the Minnesota Vikings. Some people hate it. What are your thoughts? Comment below. Subscribe. Hit that subscribe button. It's right there. And thank you for watching. And if you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please rate, review, and follow this podcast wherever you're listening. Everyone, thank you for making this podcast a part of your day.